Hi, I'm Daniela Cruz, and welcome to Art This Week. On this week's episode, we visit the Dallas Museum of Art, and our interviewer, Janelle Montgomery, speaks with curator Sue Canterbury about the exhibition Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow. Now for Art This Week.
Hi, we're at the Dallas Museum of Art with Sue Canterbury, Associate Curator of American Art and organizer of the show, Ida O'Keeffe, Escaping Georgia's Shadow. Sue, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you.
As the show's title makes clear, Ida O'Keeffe lived and worked her entire career in the shadow of her sister, Georgia. She was, in fact, Georgia's younger sister. Mm-hmm. So how did you go about finding out about Ida's art and then pulling these pieces together and organizing this show?
Finding Ida's art, initially I encountered one of the lighthouses in a local collection. And in fact, it's number 2, which is nearly
that one?
This one right here.
Okay.
Yeah, behind me. And I saw it across the room and I thought it was really strong. I could not peg it to a particular artist though. And it reminded me of Arthur Dove, but not him exactly. And so I walked over to take a closer look, and the owner informed me it was by Ida O'Keeffe, and it was sort of as if I'd been hit between the eyes, like, huh?
Yeah.
Just like everyone else who was surprised that there was a younger sister, or and a younger sister who painted. And so beyond that, in May of 2014, there was a piece done in the New York Times announcing our doing the show, mm-hmm. and that we were seeking works of art as well as information, which sort of opened the door. I won't say the floodgates, but more a door through which came emails and phone calls from people who had a connection with her, maybe through a mother, grandmother who had known her, been her friends, or also the key one was an individual called, and he began with, "You're not going to believe this, but several years before I purchased this box full of Ida O'Keeffe's records and her scrapbook and some works of art."
Real treasure.
Yes, that was sort of like the mother lode, which really provided a scaffolding, particularly for the exhibition history, because the scrapbook contained all of her exhibition brochures and clippings, newspaper clippings of her critical reviews and things of them. And some of them, are unattributed, but I know they exist because she didn't keep the masthead. But I can't find them anywhere else, but I know they exist. So that was really amazing.
And so where did the art that's here come from?
Well, basically, some was with dealers, but the majority, I would say, are with private collections. And I would say most of these individuals had either found them at sort of like thrift shops, flea markets. For instance, the Red Lighthouse behind you mm-hmm. was found in the Glendale Flea Market in Glendale, California. Yeah, and another little work of seashells was found in a thrift shop. There were several other works, particularly works on paper, her monotypes, et cetera, that were picked up at an auction in spring of '85 that had been in the possession of the youngest sister, Claudia O'Keeffe, who had died about 8 months before. So they came through these various channels, and actually 2 works turned up just at the end of this past May.
Wow, I was going to ask.
Barely in time,
Yeah.
Under the door almost, where I was wedging them into the catalog essay and, getting photography of them and stuff at the very last minute.
Yeah. So the biography that you've pulled together, basically starting with nothing, mm-hmm. is a real tour de force. Can you just briefly outline Ida O'Keeffe's life story for us?
Oh, well, okay. So essentially, she's born in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, in 1889, 2 years younger than Georgia, and she's the second of 5 sisters. Mm-hmm. And they were growing up in Sun Prairie, Wisconsin, and they studied with the same drawings teachers, not only in Sun Prairie, but in Madison, and then later at Sacred Heart Academy in Wisconsin, and then the family moved in 1903 to Williamsburg, Virginia. When they get to Williamsburg in 1903, Georgia goes off to Chatham Episcopal Institute, which is now Chatham Hall.
Right.
And it was a high school then, and Ida's at home being more or less, I think, homeschooled, because I can't find any records of her attending anywhere else there. And but then after Georgia graduates in 1905, Ida shows up there the following fall. She ends up going to Chatham but does not graduate because of the family's finances, and sits out her senior year in Williamsburg and helps her mother and helps them get ready to move. They move that summer, and then she does her first coursework at summer school at UVA, which allowed women in the summers.
So some overlap with Georgia's early education, but not a whole lot.
Well, no, but I think they really do, interestingly, share a lot of the same pedagogy, you know, in Wisconsin. And then when Ida shows up at Chatham, she studies with the same teacher, Elizabeth Willis. And then in the summers in Charlottesville, they're also studying drawing classes with like Alon Beeman, who was a student of Arthur Wesley Dow. So they both shared that in common. And then during the 1910s, you know, they diverge, but they're both teaching. Ida's teaching art around various schools in southern and southwestern Virginia, and Georgia, you know, goes here and there into South Carolina and back and whatever, and you know, goes then to Amarillo, and then will come back east and then end up in Canyon. So they're both teaching schools at the same time as one place, you know, boom, 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 you know, and not these permanent teaching assignments, but going from one school to another. And then it's in 16 that Annie Pulitzer shows Stieglitz George's drawings, where he supposedly utters the famous words, "At last, a woman on paper." And then in 1918, he brings her to New York City, where they start living together and eventually marry in 1924. Ida shows up in New York in 1918 as well, because she's just applied to nursing school at Mount Sinai because the Red Cross is asking women to sign up to become nurses so they can send them to field hospitals or, you know, populate the hospitals in the U.S. to help servicemen. And the first recorded visit I have of her through George's letter to a friend is she's at Lake George in the summer 22. And, you know, Georgia writes that, you know, she goes that Ida goes horseback riding every day, takes good care of herself, you know, sort of puts in a sort of a career of taking good care of herself. And too healthy for, you know, anyone's, you know, good.
She's a nurse.
You know, she is, you know, but she's more robust than Georgia, who's always seems like she's on the edge of starving herself, you know. So that's the first summer, and then the second summer is 1923, or fall really, fall of 23, because, you know, Stieglitz in Georgia would usually spend from about June until about November at the lake, depending on when they were ending and starting their art seasons in New York. And so Ida's there in the fall of 23. And that great photograph that Stieglitz takes of her with a gun and a squirrel, the rifle and the squirrel.
Yes, that's a great photograph.
Where, you know, it's like, you know, the O'Keeffe women, they were brought up, you know, first on a farm, you know, and then Ida subsequently teaching in all these backwater places in Virginia. You know, she knew how to wield a gun, you know, to horseback ride, to shoot, and, you know, they were raised to be independent, you know, and so he was really quite surprised by it, you know, documents it. Ida's first shot, you know, took it down with one shot. You know.
And so that relationship with Stieglitz really helped kind of open the door for Ida, not quite in the same way as it did for Georgia, as I understand it, into the New York art scene.
Well, I wouldn't say opened it for her. I think
nudge it.
Well, I mean, it's just like she was there, I think, in that sense, you know, and she'd been trained to be an art teacher. What I think it gave her access to was also, you know, visiting Stieglitz's galleries in New York, and where she comes in contact with the work of the artist of the Stieglitz Circle, Marin, Dove,
Right.
Hartley.
Right.
And so she's aware of and taking this all in, and so her exposure particularly to American modernism is key, and that core set of artists is very key.
So there's a real shift in style that you see happen between Seashells, which is I think 1927, and then she gets to the Lighthouse series, which was in the early 30s.
Right.
What
happened? Yeah, well, I mean, that's a really great story. Well, I think one of the really key things here, a key discovery for me, was when I finally sat down with all this correspondence I've been collecting, either from the Beinecke or Georgia O'Keeffe Research Center, or from individuals who'd sent in correspondence that Ida had, sent to their grandparent or whatever. Putting all these things together, what became clear, in 1925, she's doing a long-term nursing assignment in Norfolk, Connecticut, on a 1,000-acre estate for an elderly gentleman. She has a lot of time on her hands between, giving him the pills or ministering shots. And she's wandering around the cultivated gardens, but also off into the woods, whatever. They would go for rides in a carriage. He still had horses in a carriage at that time, and a car as well. But they would do these, carriage rides. And but she started going into his library, where he had a lot of material on James McNeill Whistler, and also prints by Whistler, and she became absolutely fascinated with him. Writes to Stieglitz, "Send me art materials." And first it was pen and ink and paper, and she's making copies of Whistler stuff. And then it's paints, and she starts painting, bringing in flowers, wild and cultivated, doing all these still lifes. And she writes to Stieglitz when she starts doing the painting, she says, I've never done this before. I've never had lessons in this before. And I'm thinking, what? I mean, you were an art teacher.
Yeah.
I don't get this. And so that sent me down this rabbit hole of what was art education like for young women at that time. And at that moment in time, art in these schools like Chatham Hall or Sacred Heart or wherever they had been going, generally it was considered part of domestic arts. Art came under domestic arts because art at that moment in time was considered usually to be drawing or watercolors. It was to develop a young woman's aesthetic eye. It was part of her finishing so she could create an aesthetically pleasing home for her husband and her children. But so, she doesn't know how to work with oil. She does it by trial and error. She's seeking advice from Georgia through Stieglitz, because Stieglitz was Georgia's buffer that left her time to concentrate on art.
Right.
He dealt with all these other things. Ask Georgia, if I put my paintings in the sun, will that help them dry?
Yeah.
Or the kind of oil I'm using is making my pigments sticky, or all this sort of stuff. And so she's asking all these questions. So the difference from there, she learns this trial and error, works out these things, has her first exhibition in late 27, 28, has good reviews, decides to go back to school. And the game changer is she applies to Columbia University's Teachers College. And the main influence for her there is the professor Charles James Martin, who was also Georgia's teacher in 1914. Okay, so here again we have pedagogic, common shared bond there between the two sisters. Because it was Martin who helped Georgia break away from the more representative mode into one of pulling the essence out of a subject and dealing with it more abstractly. He helped Ida do the same thing. And so he taught both sisters compositional methods that would give them more dynamic compositions, and also the manner of shading that he used. And the way I was able to really figure this all out is I found a film that he had created in 1936, and it bore the same title as his course at Columbia, Creative Design in Painting. And he went through a series of rectangles, the first using purely horizontal and vertical lines. The next one is diagonal lines moving you around the edge of the canvas. and the third was overlapping or nesting arcs going around the periphery of it, and then the fourth brought all of those lines together. And you can see a lot of that playing out in many of the lighthouse paintings, but also within several of Ida's paintings is dynamic symmetry, which is a compositional device based on the Fibonacci sequence, mathematics essentially, of using integers to calculate and to break down the canvas into a series of rectangles and triangles, and out of which you get the spirals that really activate the composition and really moves you around the eye around the canvas. And so the sisters both got the same tools, but also that empowerment to break away from strict representation into abstraction and gathering the essence of a subject.
I notice there's also a number of monotypes in the exhibition. Is that something that Ida O'Keeffe was known for?
Yes, she was very much so known for monotypes, and she garnered quite a few positive reviews from the critics, who always saw them as being rather poetic. And basically they said they liked the ones where she stayed away from the literal, where she was abstract as possible. And a really wonderful work in there in the exhibition is called Before Morn, and it's a mountain scene. And the way she has pulled out the highlights and the gradations of tone within that one work is really incredibly subtle and indeed very poetic. It's really extremely nuanced and really gorgeous. It's one of the really prime examples.
Well, it's a really beautiful show, and it's just great to see a new artist on the scene, I guess, even though she's no longer with us. So thank you so much for taking the time to join us today.
We want to thank Sue for speaking with us. For more information on the exhibition, go to dma.org. That's it for Art This Week. Thanks for watching.
I still got your Polaroid.